I've talked about video game narratives a few times on this channel, and I think part of the reason why it's particularly fascinating to me is that video games are really in a unique position when it comes to developing their own narrative structures. For one, you're usually not just spectating someone else's story. You're not a passive, omnipotent observer, but a tangible participant in the narrative, which has a huge impact on how a story hits you. For another, video games have the capacity to adapt to your past experiences with the game. The game might offer you new dialogue or even a new story if you complete it once and then go back to play it again, or maybe just have multiple routes requiring multiple playthroughs. There's also the interactable element of video games. It's one thing to watch a character on a screen solve a challenging puzzle or complete a difficult shot and know that that character likely feels some satisfaction, but it's another when you're the one who has to spend the time working it out and the euphoria that comes with all the pieces finally sliding into place. I first got into Spike Chunsoft games a little over a year ago. I played Pokemon Mystery Dungeon as a kid, but that's not really what we're talking about today. I bought Danganronpa V3 Killing Harmony on July 7th, 2022 for the Nintendo Switch, and honestly my mental health has never recovered. Thankfully, these days I have a YouTube channel built upon monetizing my mental illness, and my channel members have voted to make this your problem now. For this video, we're going to be talking about unhinged storytelling in video games, focusing on games from 4 Spike Chunsoft franchises: Danganronpa, Zero Escape, the Somnium Files, and Master Detective Archives. Now, this is obviously a stupidly long video. For one, I'm a video essayist, and video length creep is just kind of an inevitability. But also, there are 9 main series games across these 4 franchises that we've got to look at. I could easily write a full video essay about every one of these games because there's genuinely a lot to work with, but I'm not in my 5-hour video essay era yet, so I'm trying to keep it a little bit more focused. We're going to group the games based on their franchises and discuss each game in each franchise briefly, focusing on specific storytelling strengths and weaknesses of that game. So, for example, the first section is going to be Danganronpa, and we'll talk about Trigger Happy Havoc, Goodbye Despair, Killing Harmony in that order, along with some general thoughts about the series as a whole, and then we'll move on to Zero Escape and do the same thing, and then the Somnium Files, and then Master Detective Archives. Now, this video is not a review of these games, and I want to make that clear up front. It also isn't just going to be a summary of them. We're specifically talking about storytelling elements and storytelling decisions in the games and across the franchises as a whole. That does mean there are going to be spoilers, especially since we can't just ignore the endings. After all, a lot of these games really tend to sink or swim based on how successfully they stick their landing. But I've done my best to avoid spoiling the games more than necessary, and I've deliberately avoided discussing certain spoilers so that someone who watches this and then decides to play these games will still get caught off guard by certain things. It also won't cover every element of their storytelling since YouTube just doesn't allow you to upload videos longer than 12 hours. Instead, I'm going to be picking 1 or 2 things here or there that I want to highlight and talk about. The background gameplay is going to be limited to the opening minutes of each game aside from some specific screenshots and references, and this is being done for a few reasons. The first is that this is already a really labor-intensive video, and I'm already burning out a bit on it. The second is that it can actually be really hard to avoid unintentionally spoiling extra things by using footage from later in these games. But honestly, the biggest one is that there's a lot of joy to be derived from these games that specifically comes from the first moment where you see something for yourself, even if you know it's coming. And I don't want to rob someone of that if they do decide to play these games later. Before we start, I think it's also important to acknowledge that these games all fall into one of 2 narrative structures, either linear storytelling or non-linear storytelling. Danganronpa and Master Detective Archives are both linear stories, in the sense that there aren't branching paths or different routes that are going to, significantly change based on your choices and decisions. You don't need to get multiple endings in them. This is in contrast to the Zero Escape and the Somnium Files games, which follow a non-linear branching narrative. In those 2 series, there are multiple narrative routes with different endings that the player has to experience before getting to the true final ending. Danganronpa and MDA are both, start at point A and then head straight to point B stories, even if it's an unhinged journey to get from A to B. While Zero Escape and Somnium Files both follow more of a, start at point A and then go fuck yourself, because even if you make all the right decisions by accident, you're not allowed to get to point B until you've been to points C, D, E, F, and at least 12 others in terms of their story structure. Both of these structures have plenty of merit, neither is inherently good or inherently bad. Among the 9 games that are being talked about in this video, there are strong and weak games of both types, and I'm going to be doing my best to not judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree. If you'd still like to play some or all of these games in the future without spoilers, and if you haven't played them, I recommend most of them. I've made sure to include time codes for everything in the description, and we'll keep the first few seconds of discussion on each game completely spoiler-free, and by first few I mean probably 30, I don't know, to give you enough time to skip ahead. I won't spoil future games in a series during a discussion of a past game, I won't tell you what happens in Zero Time Dilemma during the section on Virtue's Last Reward, but plot points of past games in a series will obviously get referenced in terms of how they connect to the ongoing story, and sometimes in future games that we'll talk about in the video, depending on how relevant they are. Also, I want to emphasize, just because I criticize the storytelling elements in one of these games, it doesn't mean I think the game is bad. We're trying to talk about things that can help or hurt someone's efforts to tell an unhinged story, and even a good game will still stumble over stuff here and there, especially when you're trying to juggle as much as these games do. If you don't want to play these games yourself and or just want to see my mental health deteriorating while I'm playing them, my playthroughs of all the Zero Escape, Somnium Files, and MDA games are up on my VODs channel. Danganronpa isn't because I played those games before I started streaming again, but if you need 100+ hours of background noise to help prevent the risk of ever having a single moment alone with your own thoughts, you can find all those videos over there. Last thing before we get started, channel update stuff. This video was chosen as the July Members' Choice video, but had to be delayed because I had to finish the rest of the games first, and then, it's a long video, it took some time. I asked my members in advance if they'd be cool with that, and they overwhelmingly were, and I am very appreciative of that. This video beat out 3 other topics, or rather beat out 2 of them and then I was the tiebreaker, but never fear, if you were really hoping for any of them, they'll all be appearing in future months based on how they performed last month. Speaking of the Members' Choice polls, members will be choosing between these 5 topics for the month of August. Why didn't true crime cross over into video games? Positive and negative balance, the philosophies of Overwatch's heroes, Cyberpunk 2077 and the importance of understanding your genre, and why obvious solutions aren't implemented. The poll will be open until August 10th at midnight Mountain Standard Time to all channel members. You can get a monthly membership for $5 by clicking the join button below to not only support this channel, but also vote for which one of those 5 topics you want to see. Alright, enough beating around the bush, let's get to the actual discussion here, starting with our first franchise. Chapter 1.0, Danganronpa. Each Danganronpa game focuses on a group of 15 to 16 ultimate students who are considered to be the top of their field, recruited to study at an elite high school where they can hone their skills. The ultimates are then trapped somewhere by Monokuma, an evil little teddy bear who forces them to play a killing game to escape. If you choose to kill someone, you become the Blackened, and everyone else has to try and figure out who did it through a class trial. If you can successfully evade suspicion and the class votes to convict someone else, you win your freedom, and everyone else will be executed. If they find you out though, you get executed and the game continues. Throughout the games, the Ultimates are also trying to escape their situation and identify who the mastermind behind the game really is. All the while, they're being tempted by Monokuma with various motives to try and, get him to spice it up a little bit and commit a killing. Things like a large pile of cash, or automatic freedom for the first person to kill if they do so within a certain time frame. The series revolves primarily around these 2 competing concepts of hope and despair, with this often being the explicit theme of each game. The killing games themselves are generally treated as a way to force the symbols of hope to act out of despair in a way that will become contagious to the outside world, or just to the participants in some way. The Danganronpa franchise was the first I got into out of these 4, and I played through them in a bit of a weird way. Like I said earlier, I started with V3 for reasons unknown, and then I played 1 and 2. However, for the sake of handling this the way a normal person might, I'm going to be going through them in the order of their release, starting with Chapter 1.1, Danganronpa Trigger Happy Havoc. The first game in the series originally released on the PSP in Japan in 2010, with it taking another 4 years to get an official English localization for the PlayStation Vita, and another 2 years after that to get ported to Steam. The game follows Makoto Naegi, the ultimate lucky student who shows up for his first day of school at Hope's Peak Academy only to pass out in the entrance hall. When he wakes up, he finds out that he and 14 other ultimates have been trapped in the school by Monokuma, who forces them into the killing school life. Now, I will say at this point that I'm going to be affording some leniency to the first game in every franchise in this video on the grounds that they have a lot more work to do than their sequels in terms of explaining themselves and setting up the rules of the universe. Some clunky exposition is kind of inevitable, and I'm not going to ding Danganronpa 1 for some of that. Instead, I want to focus on how Trigger Happy Havoc introduces fans to the series with its first trial, and specifically how the first chapter kind of undermines its strengths with a weak first showing. The first trial in Trigger Happy Havoc, and in the whole Danganronpa franchise, is focused on the death of Sayaka Maizono, the ultimate pop sensation. She was found stabbed to death in Makoto Naegi's bathroom after the 2 swapped rooms, following the characters being given their first motive. Monokuma has done something to the people they each love most in the world and won't tell them what unless they escape, with the goal being to incentivize the characters to act violently out of despair. Right after Sayaka's death, Junko Enoshima, the ultimate fashionista, attacks Monokuma in a blind rage, leading to her execution. The death of Junko, in my opinion, is actually a really solid way to set the tone for the game. It makes it clear that Monokuma isn't fucking around, and you will face consequences for your actions. It's brutal, immediate, and consequential. You are playing a game of life and death, and if you try and mess with it, they're not gonna just, send you to the penalty box. Junko's also just, a really cool character right out of the gate, and she's got a little bit of main character energy, so when she dies, it feels like you've kind of been robbed of getting to see how the Sharpay Evans of Hope's Peak High School Musical would have handled the killing games. It also sets up a really incredible final chapter when the mysteries surrounding the 16th student and the mastermind come to a head, but we'll be getting to that later. For now, we're talking about the first chapter. More specifically, we're talking about the first trial, which immediately undermines the tone established by Junko's execution by being the most painfully simple trial to solve. See, when you're investigating the crime scene, there's a lot of evidence to examine, but a pretty major clue that the characters fixate on is the dying message Sayaka left in her own blood. 11037. They really focus on these numbers. I can't emphasize enough how much time is spent in that first chapter just going around trying to figure out what these numbers might mean, going to the computer programmer and seeing if they know what it is. Oh, I'm sorry, you see letters there? Well, Makoto doesn't, and neither does anybody else. It definitely doesn't implicate Leon Kawada or anything, not like, she literally wrote out his name as her dying message or anything. Like I said, Trigger Happy Havoc has a tough task ahead of it in trying to explain the stakes and tone that Danganronpa is supposed to have, and the first trial definitely isn't the strongest foot for the series to start on. First, it makes all these ultimates look like complete morons, which, I mean, it's fine for characters like Yasuhiro and Aoi, that's kind of who they are, but it kinda also undermines others like Kyoko or Byakuya, who are supposed to be way, way smarter than this. It also undermines the life or death stakes of the game by implying that every trial is going to be this stupidly easy to solve, which lowers the stakes of the class trials because there's not really any risk of getting it wrong or not being able to figure it out. The other major issue is that it really didn't take very long or very much pressure to pop the cherry on the killing game. A major challenge in any narrative about a killing game, especially something involuntary, is explaining what finally gets someone to crack and fire the first shot, and I don't think Trigger Happy Havoc really did a great job of that. Sayaka was killed because her motive video showed her pop idol group being taken by Monokuma, so she sets up an elaborate scheme to kill Leon in Makoto's room, then framing Makoto for the death so she could graduate and find her bandmates. And look, this is a series full of elaborate murders. Don't get me wrong, I'm not dinging it for being a complicated plot, but the attempt to lure Leon in to kill him is still kinda doing the most out of nowhere. However, Leon was able to fend off her attack. And then he kinda just goes full cold-blooded murderer. Okay, after Leon disarms her, she hides in the bathroom, and he thinks it's locked, he thinks it's a girl's bathroom, so he walks back to his room, gets his toolkit, disassembles the doorknob, and then stabs Sayaka to death before methodically cleaning up the crime scene. For both characters, it feels like they kinda just stop existing as characters and start existing as props to justify kicking off the killing game, and it sets a weak tone that doesn't really reflect the rest of the narrative. If this was just a singular bad trial, in the middle of the game, whatever, it wouldn't be so bad. But Makoto's feelings for Sayaka mean that it is constantly being dragged up over and over and over again, reminding you of the weak start that the game had. Ultimately, it just fails to set expectations properly, both for the game and the rest of the series. And look, I get it's meant to be a tutorial of sorts, but the game only has so many chapters, and it is kind of a waste to use one of them up like this. The remaining trials in the game are way, way more engaging, but if you're going to try and tell a story that's as unhinged as these games are, it's crucial to start off on the strongest possible foot in terms of establishing a tone, something that future games in the series, in my opinion, handle much better. Now, we've got to talk a little bit about the ending, because otherwise the rest of the games aren't going to make much sense, so at this point, if you don't want to know how the game ends, skip ahead a bit. Ultimately, the game ends with the reveal that Junko Enoshima never actually died. The girl killed in the first chapter was her twin sister in disguise, Mukuro Ikasaba, the ultimate soldier. Junko wasn't just the ultimate fashionista, but the ultimate analyst as well. She was brilliant to the point of basically perpetual boredom and misery, except when she was causing some despair. Despair to Junko is chaotic and messy and tragic, and brings her and Mukuro a lot of pleasure. She was the one who'd caused the original tragedy of Hope's Peak Academy when she forced Hope's Peak Student Council into the first killing game. From there, she brainwashed the reserve course students, and we'll be getting to them in a second, and caused the biggest, most awful, most tragic event in human history, plunging the world into despair, and yes, that is the actual canonical name for that event. The students of Trigger Happy Havoc had voluntarily locked themselves in the school to protect themselves from the tragedy, but Junko hijacked the plan and implemented the killing school life. However, she still follows the rules of her own game, and when the students find her guilty, she's executed just like anyone else. The 5 survivors, Makoto, Kyoko, Yasuhiro, Byakuya, and Toko, manage to escape and see what's happened over the years that they've lost as a result of Junko wiping their memories. With their stories settled, it's time to move on to Chapter 1.2, Danganronpa 2 Goodbye Despair. Goodbye Despair is probably the most well-liked game in the series, and it's not really that hard to see why. It takes what worked from Trigger Happy Havoc and refines it, while discarding or iterating upon the things that really didn't. Originally released in Japan in 2012 for the PSP, it later got a PS Vita release in 2013 in Japan, before being released around the world over the course of 2014. The setting has also changed. Instead of happening at Hope's Peak Academy, the characters are trapped on Jabberwock Island, and Monokuma isn't the one who initially brought them there. The real answer is incredibly complicated, but the simple answer is that it was Usami, who calls herself the teacher leading a school trip to help the students become better friends.
Let the heart-throbbing school trip begin!
However, the trip is then hijacked by Monokuma, who forces the characters into another killing game against the wishes of Usami, who Monokuma has also now renamed to Monomi, retconning her into being his sister. When I started working on this video, this game was kind of the hardest one to figure out where to start with, because it's hard to pin down what exactly makes Goodbye Despair's story so well liked, or identify a single element that makes it work. However, for this video I'd make the argument that it just really knows how to be a sequel, which is not as straightforward as it sounds, especially for a series like this. You can't just bring the whole cast again for round 2 on account of all the dying that they did, so you need a new cast who can live up to the precedent the old cast set. You need to maintain the killing game, but you have to do it in a way that's engaging for people who know who was behind the last game and why it happened, and why that can't be the case again. You need it to be new, but also familiar. Better than the last game, but still identifiable with it. And also break new ground with the same old formula. And Goodbye Despair kind of just knocks it out of the park on all counts. The new casts are really solid. The new setting of Jabberwock Island allows for a more dynamic killing game, and the writers did a really good job of building off the ending of Trigger Happy Havoc. A game that ends pretty definitively in a lot of ways, especially in terms of explaining why there shouldn't be another killing game. What I want to specifically touch on, though, is how it invokes those things from the previous game and plays with audience expectations, recontextualizing familiar elements to make it easier for players to pick up on the story's momentum without giving away its direction. Just like Trigger Happy Havoc, there's another ultimate lucky student, another student who doesn't know their ultimate, another Monokuma, another student apparently killed for attacking him, another mysterious mastermind apparently lurking in their midst, another double kill in Chapter 3, but they're not just included as throwbacks. I mean, love him or hate him, Nagito was a really interesting way to explore the ramifications of luck being something tangible and manipulatable in this universe. Hajime not knowing what his ultimate is isn't a setup for him eventually to reveal some super useful ultimate. Instead, it turns out he has nothing, and has to cope with being kind of a second-class student compared to the others. He's one of those reserve course students that I talked about before. Someone with no ultimate ability whose parents paid a fortune to send him to Hope's Peak, and who the main course students generally tend to look down on a bit. Monokuma's return comes with a lot of questions that leave you guessing, especially with the addition of Monomi, and the game's approach to the concept of a mastermind, lurking among them again, is really done well. Nekomaru's quote-unquote death at the hands of Monokuma feels like a throwback to Junko's death in Trigger Happy Havoc, but his return and transformation are a sharp reminder to not let your experiences from Trigger Happy Havoc influence what you think Goodbye Despair is going to do. The Chapter 3 double kill is handled entirely differently from in the first game, and aside from just being a double kill, it's used to tease the players about what's happening just enough to make it clear that they're going to miss something important if they're just looking for the story to hit the same beats as Trigger Happy Havoc. When it comes to telling unhinged stories, it can be hard to trust your audience. There's a tendency towards over-relying on exposition or trying to hold their hand because you're throwing a lot at them. While I think Trigger Happy Havoc stumbles because it felt the need to do that, Goodbye Despair took full advantage of the fact that it trusted its players who would have, some baseline familiarity with the setting and premise to tell a really strong story with a lot more consistency in terms of the tone and quality. Some of this also comes from having a better understanding of what worked in the previous game and what didn't. The new characters and setting weren't just a chance to elevate what they'd done in Trigger Happy Havoc, they were also a chance to scrap the things that didn't work. On top of all of that, more than any other game we've talked about in this video, it does an amazing job of using everything from in-universe hints to the UI to hint at the big final twist of the game. And again, this is your point to tune out if you don't want the big final spoilers for this one.
Hey, you guys! Don't forget about me! Hey, wait for me! Let me join in the fun! Wait, huh?
The twist being that the students were actually the remnants of Despair, part of the, cult? Terrorist group? Some combination of the two that formed in the wake of Junko's death in the previous game. They'd been trapped in a simulation by Makoto Naegi, protagonist of Trigger Happy Havoc and current member of the Future Foundation, which is an organization built on trying to fight back against the Despair. Makoto has gone rogue, kidnapping the remnants and trapping them in the simulation, which was supposed to rehabilitate them by making them forget their despair. Unfortunately, he'd been duped. Hajime Hinata, or more accurately, Izuru Kamakura, planted a virus in the system before being put in order to introduce Junko and the killing game to the simulation. Each time a student died, the plan was for their body to become an empty vessel that Junko could take over, potentially creating up to 16 more of her. Oh yeah, by the way, it turns out that Hajime was a reserve corps student, but he desperately wanted to be an ultimate. So desperately that he consented to being the subject of an experiment to create the ultimate hope. It wiped his personality and completely replaced it with a brand new one, Izuru Kamakura, who possesses every other ability but just, better than everyone else. He's the ultimate everything. Just like Junko, he kinda ends up getting bored of hope. When you're so good at everything, it kinda gets tiring quickly, and he joins her when he realizes that Despair has some more unpredictability, some more excitement to it. But then, a sudden death and a character's inexplicable behavior during the climax of the Despair arc of a separate anime, Danganronpa 3: The End of Hope's Peak Academy, convinces him that Hope still has an unpredictable side. So he makes a decision to put them to the test, bring Hope and Despair into conflict in the simulation and see what excites him more. However, something that he didn't really seem to anticipate was that the simulation would also revert him back to Hajime, and over time, both personalities kind of merge? It's incredibly convoluted. I am greatly oversimplifying what happened, but also, honestly, it's really well done, and it makes for probably the strongest ending in the series. The fact that Goodbye Despair is so fondly remembered, even in spite of giving everyone brain bleeds in the Strawberry House and the Grape House, and not to mention allowing almost everyone to survive the killing game, which, you might think might undermine the tone of it, but kinda doesn't really, is all honestly proof if proof were needed about just how much it gets right. Now, time to move on to the next game. Chapter 1.3, Danganronpa V3 Killing Harmony.
This is me. My name is Kaede Akamatsu. I just remembered who I am. Nice to meet me. I'm the protagonist of this crazy story.
Alright, look. I'm a V3 defender to the bone, and I'm going to admit my bias up front. This is my favorite Danganronpa game. I recognize that that's an incorrect opinion. I do not care. At the end of the day, I'm a somber main. You signed up for these kind of takes. This game takes place in a new arc for Danganronpa. The Hope's Peak arc ended with Danganronpa 3, the anime that I mentioned for a second earlier, with Killing Harmony being the beginning of the Ultimate Academy arc. This game was also the first mainline Danganronpa game with a female protagonist, with the player playing as Kaede Akamatsu, the ultimate pianist. Monokuma also returns as the headmaster, this time with his 5 monocubs in tow. The game was released worldwide in 2017, mostly. Some countries did not allow it to be released, starting with a January PS4 and PS Vita launch in Japan before a global Steam release in September. Killing Harmony is a polarizing game for a whole bunch of reasons, but before we get into the negative stuff, I want to focus on the good. The first thing that I think this game does really well is that it leans into the ultimate abilities a lot more than the other games, and I think that's actually one of its biggest strengths compared to them. To be clear, the ultimate abilities are obviously still incorporated in the other games. You've got Chiaki's programming skills, or Leon's baseball abilities, whatever, but Killing Harmony ramps it up a lot by keeping the focus on it a lot more. Every ultimate has a research lab, a room stocked with things to help them specifically train their specific skills. The ultimate pianist gets a room with a piano and a ton of music books. The ultimate tennis player gets a room with a tennis court and a machine to play against. It's a strong way of emphasizing the ultimates for their abilities, rather than letting those abilities kind of fade into the background until it's relevant to the plot. It was also a really, really good way to allow the game to return to a school setting without it feeling as limited as Hope's Peak sometimes did, and also reveals the ultimate stories more consistently. Each time a new lab gets exposed, it pushes forward that character's story as well as creates new opportunities for a creative kill. It would have been hard to tell the stories of characters like Maki, Rantaro, or Kokichi without also being able to use their labs to expose more about them. Now, I would argue that the game's single strongest point is its first chapter, particularly the reveal of the guilty party. Monokuma's first motive in this game is the First Blood perk. The first killer will automatically get to escape without a trial. Probably the strongest first motive in the series as far as I'm concerned. There's a ticking clock though. If nobody is killed within the first 48 hours, everyone will die. Kaede, along with her sidekick Shuichi, the ultimate detective, discover a hidden door in the library and devise a plot to expose who the mastermind is with a handful of cameras and motion sensors. At the last minute, right before the timer runs out and everyone dies, somebody triggers the motion sensors, and Shuichi and Kaede race to see who it was, only to find Rantaro dead, a shot put ball laying bloodied beside him. Monokuma reveals that no, he was not the mastermind and the game will continue, and soon it becomes clear that his killer is not claiming their First Blood perk. All 15 surviving students participate in the class trial after an investigation, and once again it's time to see who the guilty party is. How is this game going to introduce itself to the players? How is it going to set its tone? Turns out, it's coming out of the gates fucking swinging, with the trial ultimately revealing that you, Kaede, were the killer all along. All along you thought you were the protagonist, but that was just Kaede's lie. While you were playing as her, Kaede had been secretly setting up an elaborate murder scheme involving dropping a shot put ball down a vent and down a ramp of books to try and kill the mastermind, who she'd hoped would be the person who tripped the alarm. When it turned out she'd hit the wrong target, she forfeited her First Blood perk and was eventually found guilty of the murder. Midway through the trial, you take control of Shuichi as he eventually exposes her crimes and sentences her to death. As far as I'm concerned, it's easily the strongest first trial of any of the 3 games, and her execution is equally top tier. I think there's a lot of value in dropping your players in at the deep end when it comes to telling unhinged stories. Like I said, this was my first Danganronpa game, so I had no context for what to expect, and I think this was legitimately the best way to be introduced to the series. There's a lot to be said for not holding your players' hands as they learn the ropes if your goal is to keep them off balance and keep them second guessing, and the first chapter of Killing Harmony establishes that tone better than the first chapters of Trigger Happy Havoc or Goodbye Despair. However, in contrast to Trigger Happy Havoc, where the game had nowhere to go but up from the first trial, or, Goodbye Despair, where it could keep the momentum going, Killing Harmony's first trial is kinda so strong that it becomes increasingly hard to match. On top of that, it has to try and match the last two games in terms of delivering on a big plot twist. And it tries to have its cake and eat it too by creating a new arc that's separate from the baggage of Hope's Peak, while still trying to dip into it here and there to make the twist seem even more crazy. While the rest of the game's chapters are individually pretty solid, aside from, in my opinion, the third chapter, which is a little bit much, it's hard to not feel like the game's tension peaks in that first chapter and then kinda lulls a bit. Trigger Happy Havoc starts too slow for the story it's trying to tell, while Killing Harmony kinda starts too fast. It's a really good twist, don't get me wrong, I loved it. I was losing my goddamn mind. But putting a twist like that in your first chapter also means the rest of the game has to try and live up to it, and that's just really hard. Goodbye Despair, in my opinion, was the most successful at ratcheting up the intensity in a way that made it feel like the stakes were being raised, and just generally increasing the tension of the story. However, that's forgivable, and if you find a V3 hater, it's probably not because of that. It probably also isn't really the characters, who are certainly polarizing to some people, but I'd argue are generally a solid roster, and people usually like at least some of them. The real villain of the story is the ending. Initially, it seems like the game's twist is going to be that they're not actually in a school at all, but on an ark in space for something called the Gopher Project. The world is going to be destroyed in a hail of meteorites, and 16 talented students were chosen to continue humanity's legacy by being sent into space to protect them. The students all initially refused, choosing to have their memories of their ultimates wiped, but after a cult of fanatics learned of the project, they attempted to have the ultimates killed to force humanity to face the punishment that the universe had wrought upon it. To protect them, the government faked their deaths, and the students agreed to finally board the ark. Students eventually opened a door to the outside, only to see that they had landed back on Earth, but the planet was decimated. The only livable place is inside the Ark, under Monokuma's control. It's then revealed that the Cult of Fanatics had actually been the remnants of Despair, and that this all ties back into the Hope's Peak arc, and now Kokichi was the leader of those remnants. And then it turns out that actually, no, none of that's true. Not only that, but the first trial was a false execution as well. Kaede did attempt to kill someone with a shot put ball, but it failed. She missed her shot. And after she missed, the true mastermind of the game snuck up behind Rentaro and killed him with a second shot put ball, framing her. I mean, why was Rentaro there? Well, you see, it turns out that he was a survivor of Danganronpa V2, and so had received something called the Survivor's Perk, a tablet that included, among other things, a more detailed map of the school with the secret lair included. He went to check it out, hoping to discover who the mastermind was, thinking that they would, sneak away to their secret lair before the mass killing happened. Unfortunately for him, he got caught in Kaede's trap instead. Oh, what's Danganronpa V2? Sorry, I should explain here. The V in the name is actually representing the Roman numeral for 5, meaning that Danganronpa V3 is actually Danganronpa 53, the 53rd season of a hit reality competition show based on the popular fictional series Danganronpa. This is a fully separate universe from the Hope's Peak arc. In the Ultimate Academy arc, all the previous Danganronpa media was an in-universe fictional craze, and it became so popular that it became real. This was the ultimate real-life fiction, and high school students could audition for the Killing Games. They'd have their memories wiped and be added to the game with a new ultimate, new abilities, whatever. By giving people an outlet for their despair, it brought peace to the world. At this point, again, spoilers for the end of the game, we're going to be talking about who the mastermind is. You've got a few seconds to click away before we get into it.
Huh?
Now, turns out, Tsumugi was the mastermind all along, and she had been producing the whole series from the inside as part of Team Danganronpa, including killing Rentaro and framing Kaede. There had also actually been a 6th secret monocub, the Nanokumas, a swarm of microscopic robots with cameras that were filming the whole thing. They were the film crew for the TV show that they were doing. Kibo, the ultimate robot, had also actually been puppeted by the audience through fan votes all along. He was their representative in the game. I mean, aside from a brief period where his antenna was knocked off and he went rogue and blew up some stuff, but they reattached it, was fine. Throughout the Killing Game, the students had been given flashback lights, devices that they thought were returning their memories, but were actually implanting more false ones that were eventually uncovered by exposing the contradictions in those memories. At the end of it all, the surviving Ultimates are asked to choose between hope and despair in front of a live television audience, only to realize that the satisfaction that comes from a completed arc, a completed narrative, is what allows the Killing Games to continue, and they decide to refuse to choose in order to turn off viewers and get the show cancelled. Miraculously, this somehow works. Somehow, over 53 seasons of Killing Games with children, they've apparently never had somebody be uncooperative before, and people immediately tune out. Kibo breaks free from the audience control and goes rogue again, killing Tsumugi before self-destructing and shattering the dome that kept the students contained. The final survivors, Shuichi, Maki, and Himiko, escape into an unknown world. Now, this ending has been polarizing to a lot of people, and for good reason. Nobody wants the media that they're consuming to turn around and point a finger at them and say, see, you're the problem for enjoying this kind of media. Like that Katy Perry song, Chained to the Rhythm, which was kind of just shitting on catchy pop music for brainwashing the masses. And I mean, like, if you're a fan of Katy Perry in 2017 hearing that song for the first time, you're probably kind of just like, you know, fuck you. Why are you trashing me for enjoying your music? You are the shallow pop musician. Beyond that, though, it's also just, like, not a good ending. If you believe Tsumugi, then it outright sucks. It feels like twist on top of twist for the sake of twists, undermining the narrative from past games and the narrative of killing Harmony itself just to try and stay 2 steps ahead of the players. They took the approach that worked well for the first chapter, but didn't know when to stop, and ended up doing too much, shooting themselves in the feet in the process. However, if you believe that Tsumugi was lying, or was an unreliable narrator, or was just brainwashed and thought she was telling the truth, then you can decide that. You can believe that she is just an unreliable narrator and discard the bullshit reality TV ending. Only problem is that there's nowhere else to go from there. If Tsumugi was full of shit, which is my belief, I'm on that side of things, it's hard to really tell who the antagonist of the story was or what they're getting out of any of this, what the story was about. If this is what you believe, the story's unfinished in a way that the other ones weren't. And given that it seems like a true sequel is still a long ways off, if it ever happens at all, you're going to remain unsatisfied with it. Regardless, the game tries to swing too hard and ends up missing big. The game itself was really fun, don't get me wrong, but the ending sours it for a lot of people. And at the end of the day, the hardest part of telling an unhinged story is managing to stick the landing. Out of all 3 Danganronpa games, Killing Harmony's ending is easily the weakest. Chapter 1.4 Final Thoughts on Danganronpa. Danganronpa is a really special series to me, and I have a lot of love for all 3 games. Part of what makes them work so well, at least in my opinion, is that they're able to build off of a really strong concept. The premise of a killing game is just really exciting. We tend to like media like that. I don't know, maybe someday I'll do a video about that specific phenomenon, because that's its whole own can of worms, but in general, the format is something that's really easy to turn into a series. You know, there's a reason why there are also a bunch of Danganronpa fan games. Anybody can come up with 16 ultimate abilities, design characters around them, throw them into a random environment, and then tell them to kill each other. The big challenge of these games, then, is finding ways to tell an impactful story with them. Something that gets harder and harder each time you do it because you can't just retread old ground. Like, Junko can't always be the mastermind. It worked in Trigger Happy Havoc as a solid plot twist because you thought she was already dead, and it worked in Goodbye Despair kind of for the same reason because the twist about being in a simulation works, with her being dead for real this time. But there is a law of diminishing returns with that stuff. If she was the mastermind for a 3rd straight time, it'd just be like, okay, cool, I guess, but at this point, like, why bother? Like, why does this story bother wasting 30 hours of my life just to tell me Junko somehow did it again? But also, if Junko doesn't do it, then you need to find a new mastermind. Someone who can hold a candle to her, can match her intensity, and can justify why they'd continue the games even without having her specific motivation. The games focus on hope versus despair, sometimes definitely slides into being corny, but Junko is a big part of what makes that theme fun. This idea that she's just basically so smart that she's gotten bored of hope and peace and just finding a lot of joy in despair is interesting, it's funny. Now, does that mean that any of this is the most logical motivation to have? No, obviously not. Neither is Izuru's motivation for trying to bring her into the New World simulation. But their approach to the hope versus despair dynamic is a motivation that works for the game's premise in a way that I don't think Tsumugi's motivations do, and V3 kind of shows how badly it can go wrong when you feel like you need to outsmart and outtwist your players and your audience. Ironically, a problem it shares with a lot of reality TV franchises like Survivor or RuPaul's Drag Race that just inexplicably feel the need to pile on new twist after new twist that nobody wanted that dilute the core premise that people really did love. The more unhinged the story gets, the more important it is that it really sticks the landing, and I don't think it would have been as rough if Killing Harmony had just picked one twist and stuck with it. Trigger Happy Havoc and Goodbye Despair don't have nice, simple, easy endings, but they do both still feel like climaxes to the story you've been playing the whole time. Killing Harmony's ending is just not that. Anyways, we've rambled about Danganronpa enough. We still have, oh holy shit, 6 more games to get through, and I'm about to be a massive hater about one of them. So with that, let's move on to Chapter 2.0, Zero Escape. Zero Escape is a hard series to explain because relatively little of it remains consistent, but I'm going to try and do my best for you. The way a game usually starts is that 9 people will find themselves trapped in some sort of an isolated, sealed-off location, with the goal of escaping by winning a challenging game. The first game, 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors, features the Nonary game. The second game, Virtue's Last Reward, features the Nonary game Ambidex Edition. And the third game, Zero Time Dilemma, features the Decision game. We'll explain the rules of each game when we get to them, but in general, the Zero Escape series is about escape rooms. Minigames where players enter rooms with different groups of characters and have to solve the puzzle in order to escape it. The branching pathways of the game's narratives come from which rooms you choose to explore with which characters, which will result in learning new information that you can carry across different timelines. Then you use those to uncover new story elements for reasons that could count as a spoiler, so we're not going to get into it yet. At the start of each game, each player is also given a wristwatch of sorts that's impossible to remove and serves a different purpose depending on the game. However, it broadly functions as a way for players to be monitored and managed, and as a way to execute players who break rules. Each game also has a Zero, a game master of sorts, who organizes the whole thing and is running it from behind the scenes for some mysterious purpose. Zero explains the rules of the games to the players, inflicts penalties, and is ultimately the key to figuring out why the players have been forced to play the games. The final important bit is that the games are a blend of collaboration and competition with fellow participants, particularly in the first two games where the rules do technically allow every player to escape safely if they work together. However, there's not a ton else that I can say about the series as a whole for our purposes, so we should probably just get into individual games. Chapter 2.1 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors. Going forward, I'm just going to be referring to this as 999, by the way. First game in the series, it originally came out on the DS in Japan in December of 2009, followed by a North American DS release in November of 2010. The game follows Junpei, a stupid man I hate who is terrible for reasons we'll get into shortly, as he and 8 other people wake up in a boat of some sort after being kidnapped while trying to survive the nonary game. Now, if you've been around the channel for a while, you probably know that this video topic that I'm doing right now is actually a rework of an old Members' Choice topic that I had. 999 made me hate the Titanic and telepathy. And if you put 2 and 2 together here, you can probably guess that I don't have a ton of kind things to say about this game. However, I also want to emphasize that I don't hate it. It is a deeply flawed game, but I still enjoyed playing it, especially since it was the first non-Overwatch game I really streamed, so I don't know, I've got a bit of a special relationship to it, I guess. Zero Escape is also a series with some really high highs and some very low lows, and I would rank 999 as being solidly the middle of the bunch. I just kind of wanted to clarify that stuff before we get into it, and with that out of the way, let's talk about the narrative. Namely, why its inability to stop tripping over its own dick is the biggest obstacle to making this game as good as it could be. The premise of the game is relatively-ish straightforward. You and 8 other players need to escape the ship that you're on before it floods with water. After escaping the room he was initially locked in, Junpei meets the other participants on the main floor in front of a series of numbered doors, and Zero explains the rules to them. Each player has a bracelet with a number between 1 and 9 on it. Each door can be opened by combining no fewer than 3 and no greater than 5 players' bracelet numbers that result in the same digital root as the number on the door. For example, if you wanted to open the number 3 door, you might use 2, 4, and 6, which add up to give you 12, and 1 plus 2 equals 3. That's a digital root. You tap your bracelets on a red machine outside the door, called the red, and then you pull a lever to open it. Once the door is open, you have 9 seconds to enter before it closes. Only the people who have entered their bracelets are allowed to enter the door, but nobody has to. However, once somebody does, they have 81 seconds from when the door closes to find the dead to deactivate their watches, basically just a black version of the red. If all the people who entered their bracelets to open the door and also entered the door don't deactivate their watches in time, it'll trigger a bomb in their stomachs, killing them. The goal of the players is to find the number 9 door and escape through it. This is the nonary game, because nonary means 9 or whatever. If this all sounds like it leans a little bit too heavily on being about the number 9, its multiples, all that shit, you would be correct. Like many things in this game, it is a neat idea that quickly gets old and becomes annoying because of the big flaw of this game: a lack of editing. Nothing is handled concisely or coherently, and I know that sounds a little bit rich coming from a video essayist, but bear with me. It's apparent right from the start that this is a problem. The first hour of the game is one fun escape room followed by a long, tedious, rambling explanation of the nonary game by Zero that just immediately kills the game's momentum stone dead. And this kind of thing happens over and over and over again. Lengthy explanations of stuff like Iced 9, the Egyptian mummy All Ice, or Alice, the Titanic and its sister ship, the Gigantic, morphogenetic fields, and so much more. This is a game that needed a fucking editor to come in and cut down hard on the mind-numbing exposition that you are constantly being stonewalled by, especially since the dialogue in this game is written pretty poorly when it comes to exposition. The characters have decently interesting personalities sometimes, depending on which one you're looking at, but regardless, they go out the fucking window in favor of turning them into robots, vomiting exposition at you out of nowhere for way too long. Like, it's never just like, oh hey, I think this ship kind of reminds me of the Titanic. Maybe this is its sister ship? It has to be a 10-minute rant about the ship and the Egyptian mummy that was on it, and just all this other nonsense that makes no sense and often goes nowhere. Like, several characters break character for 5+ minute rambling monologues about that Egyptian mummy, who they call All Ice or Alice. And you know what role she plays in the game's narrative, like, at all? Like, seriously, if you don't know, pause, try and guess. She is mentioned constantly throughout the game. You literally find her tomb at one point, but just try and guess what role she plays. The answer is literally none. She's nothing but a joke cameo ending where she's shown for a single shot trying to hitchhike away from the ship while the other participants of the nonary game escape. She doesn't matter, which makes all that time spent hearing about her feel even more frustrating with hindsight. Same goes with the rambling about the Gigantic. It doesn't really fucking matter. The fact that it's the Gigantic literally doesn't matter. It could have been any boat. It did not have to be the Gigantic, it didn't have to be related to Titanic, none of it. it would have played an identical role in the game. But because they've made it gigantic, they have to throw in a ton of genuinely useless, worthless exposition about it that makes the game feel like just a drag to get through. The idea of Ice 9? It's used to argue that not only can humans access those morphogenetic fields, but that inanimate objects can too, and share characteristics through it. This is also something that happens with gelatin crystallizing, which you hear about in a separate, stupid rant from 7. Legitimately the only one of these that I can remember actually mattering to some degree is the morphogenetic field specifically, a really nebulous idea that in this game boils down to a version of telepathy that crosses space and in some instances time as well. Lotus explains the concept, at least briefly, in the very first numbered door you go through if you go with her, Santa, and June, and it turns out to be the crux of the whole narrative. However, it's hard to really keep track of it because you're trying to juggle all these other things that the game throws at you, and the game's lack of direction does not place an appropriate amount of narrative weight on it, and that comes back to bite it in the ass.
Alright, my number's 5. So my code name is gonna be...
Why have one? It's not like there's any point to it now.
A lot of the endgame is spent trying to explain all the conditions of the morphogenetic field, culminating in the reveal that June is actually 0. Not because she wants to kill them, but because 9 years earlier she was trapped in the first nonary game and couldn't solve the final puzzle by herself. So she... uses her powers to set up an investment firm with her brother, who was also trapped with her, make $1 billion or something, I don't know, finance a second nonary game where the sole purpose is to get Junpei to the end so he can solve the puzzle and send the solution back in time to her 9 years in the past. Also, the June you've been playing the whole game with is like, not real? Maybe real? I'm not even sure. Also, usually only espers can connect to the morphogenetic field, and only to people that they have a really strong connection to, but I don't know, I guess a childhood crush counts? The point that I'm trying to make is that this game needed an editor. Someone who could come in and say that you were spending too much time in this section talking about this thing that doesn't matter, and it is killing the momentum. Cut it and move on. Or someone who can say, you have woefully underexplained this concept that's fundamental to the game, please find a way to make it more clear. Editors are a crucial part of any storytelling process because we're actually really bad at understanding how our own stories come across to other people. Something that seems really obvious to you, the person writing the story, might only seem obvious because you've had this idea in your mind for years. It might not make sense to anybody else, and you need to find a way to make it make sense to people without forcing them to think about it for all those years. You need someone who can come in and say, okay, you've massively underdeveloped the characters of Lotus in 7, or hey, if this is how Lotus looks, you can't actually make it so that every line of dialogue is someone calling her a dried up, wrinkly raisin of a grandma because it makes no fucking sense. Unhinged stories rely on their editors in large part because the type of person who wants to write this kind of story is the kind of person who, you know, shocker of all shockers, enjoys when things are unhinged, which can lead to a tendency to do stupid shit that doesn't make sense and needs to be reined in. This is especially true when the story includes branching narratives with multiple endings because it becomes so much easier to fall into the trap of over-exposition or under-exposition in order to try and work around the obstacles that the format kind of inherently has. And this game either did not have an editor, or they dropped the ball hard. Now, I want to make it clear again, with all that said, let me reiterate, this is actually still a pretty decently fun game. The problem isn't that it's a bad game, it's that it could have been a really amazing game, but it, again, trips over its own dick until it was just good. Thankfully, the sequel put it back in its pants for long enough to show just how well they could do this type of story. And now, it's time to talk about Chapter 2.2, Virtue's Last Reward. Virtue's Last Reward, or VLR, first released in Japan for the 3DS and PS Vita in February of 2012, before being released in North America and Europe in the fall of the same year, and it's the best game in this series. Somehow, just like with Danganronpa, the Zero Escape series managed to start decently strong before knocking it out of the park with its sequel. In this game, you play as Sigma, a college student who was kidnapped on Christmas Day of 2028. He woke up in an elevator with a girl named Phi, where the two solve an escape room before meeting with the other participants. Mostly brand new characters, with the exception of Clover, who sucked in the first game and is legitimately one of the weakest points of this one too. I know that's not really relevant, but good god, I fuck Clover. There's also Alice, a conspicuously familiar looking character. I wonder what her deal is. The nonary game Ambidex Edition drops a lot of the structure with the first game, and a lot of the issues as a consequence, replacing it with more of a Schrodinger's cat meets the prisoner's dilemma scenario. The game is run by Zero Jr., this little rabbit looking guy. He's fun, he's enjoyable. Voice acted very well, I will say that. At the start of each round, each of the 9 players will be assigned a color and classified as either a solo or a pair. If you're a solo, you operate alone, and if you're part of a pair, then you and your partner are treated as a single entity for the purposes of that round. The players are then presented with a series of 3 colored doors called chromatic doors. In order to enter them, you need a combination of 3 people, 1 solo and 1 pair whose bracelet colors mix to form that color, or form its opposite. For example, a cyan pair and a yellow solo could open a green door, or the yellow pair and cyan solo, or the magenta pair and magenta solo. If you don't enter a door, you will die, so that's not exactly the ideal option. If you enter a door with an incorrect color combination or the wrong number of people, congratulations, you will also die. However, assuming that everyone can do first grade colors, you'll then get spat out into an escape room. Solve it, grab a keycard, use that keycard to open the ambidex room. Once you're in the room, you'll be voting to either ally or betray the other team that you just did the escape room with. This is where the prisoner's dilemma part of it comes in. In order to escape the facility, you need to get your score, or your bracelet points is what they call it, BP, up to 9. Everybody starts the game with 3, and gains or loses them based on the results of the ambidex game. If both parties ally, they both get 2 points. If they both betray, nobody gets anything. If one party betrays but the other allies, the traitor gets 3 points and the person they betrayed loses 2. Pairs are treated as a single entity for this, meaning that they collectively cast a single vote and both face the consequences of that one vote. Once you get 9 points, you can open the door, but you don't have to. This game is easily the most complicated in the series in terms of just like the amount of stuff that happens, with a frankly stupid number of branching paths and endings. Each time you choose a door to go through, that creates a branching path, and each time you vote, same deal. There are about 20-ish different endings depending on your political beliefs, but there are 11 that are outright bad endings where you gain nothing except an L, and 9 character endings where you gain crucial information for completing the game. While you're playing the game, you'll quickly realize that Sigma is able to sometimes remember fragments of other timelines. For example, in my first playthrough, I initially teamed up with Alice and then voted to betray her, which understandably pissed her off. After a while, though, I came back to that point in the game and voted instead to ally with her, only to discover that she also changed her vote. Now, I had been betrayed by Alice. Sigma in the game gets confused because he thought he remembered her voting to ally, and over time, it turns out he's not the only one who can remember things across timelines. Spike can too, although usually not as well. This story brings back the morphogenetic fields and the idea of the espers, but instead of sending messages just to like your special person, the other guy in your group, whatever, it's more that they can pull their memories from other timelines. This is also its biggest strength over 999. It fully commits to the bit. Once you make a choice, it's a divergent path. You don't get to eventually just loop back to the same convergence points but with new information. It helps to emphasize that every choice matters and reinforces the way that decisions have knock-on consequences that you can't always predict. It does a good job of handling both of its core concepts, Schrodinger's cat and multiple worlds theory, in a way that allows for the story to be both just completely batshit insane and somehow still end in a way that feels... Good feels like it's understating how messed up some stuff is, but in a satisfying way. Honestly, it helps that these are the only games in the series where you spend a very minimal amount of time with Akane, and where Junpei isn't acting like Junpei. 2 characters who I can't stand and I wish genuinely just weren't part of it. Their dynamic sucks, but as senior citizens, they're the most tolerable they're ever gonna be. Clover is a pain in the ass, but at least it's more tonally consistent than her character in 999, where she is just the fucking worst. Alice is a remarkably fun character for someone who just initially seemed like a bad joke that'd gone too far. Quark is inconsequential but mostly harmless. Luna is a great character done fucking dirty by the next game, we'll get to that. Sigma is a solid protagonist. Phi is a great counterpart for him. Dio is a fucking menace, and I can honestly respect them for turning Red Era Taylor Swift into a pretty compelling antagonist. We haven't even touched on Radical 6 yet, which is the virus at the center of the game, because if we got into that too much, we'd be here all day, but genuinely, I would argue it's a really well-handled part of the story. Be really easy for that kind of a virus to end up being, you know, too much for them to get mired in it, to fall down that rabbit hole, but instead they kind of allow it to exist as a plot point without losing themselves in it. This game is proof that you don't need to streamline things down to make an Unhinged story more digestible. If anything, it kind of makes the opposite point. If you're going to try to swing big, you need to commit to it. Like, as a kid, I played baseball for a little while, and one of the hardest skills to learn is being able to identify a good pitch early enough to commit fully to taking a swing. If it's a bad pitch, you need to be able to just let it go, but if it's a good pitch, you don't have 45 minutes to decide whether or not it's good. You need to be able to put your effort into connecting with that ball pretty fast. If you half-ass the swing, even on a perfect pitch, you're not going to get where you need to go. With a story like this, if it had tried to do what 999 had done, it wouldn't have worked. It needed to be this massive, unwieldy, branching narrative to emphasize its point. It needed to be this massive monstrosity of a timeline, because that is how you communicate the most important part of this game.
So, hurry up and get out! I'll be waiting! Alright, I forgot to tell you the most important thing. This elevator you're in, it's gonna fall in a few minutes. Way down.
The whole point is for Sigma and Phi to learn to control their ability to jump between timelines in order to jump back to prevent a tragedy. It also really emphasizes the importance of planning when trying to tell a story like this. You can't just be like, oh, and it'd be cool if X thing happened and just throw random shit at the wall because it sounds fun without a real plan for it. Not only is VLR an insane game in terms of how complicated it gets, it's also a really obviously well-planned game. Even setting aside the escape rooms, which are incidentally handled better than any of the other games in the series in my opinion, the story is just planned really well. Does that mean it's perfect? No. But it properly allocates time for you to get to know and care about the other characters, except for Quark, who I think got overlooked for obvious reasons, but that's beside the point, while also giving you a lot of time and space to explore the entire facility and take in the environment. You get to see how the characters react to different situations, which gives you a fuller understanding of who each of them are, meaning that their reactions and responses to the rest of the game's events in different timelines are going to make a lot more sense. Ultimately, and this is where we're going to have some spoilers for the end of the game ends with the discovery that Sigma was actually in the body of his much, much older self the whole time. Not only that, but he was the one who designed the Ambidex game. Then his younger self swapped bodies with his older self without him realizing, so that the version of Sigma that you've been playing this whole time was just Freaky Friday'd. The ending of this game is stupid complicated. It'd take an hour, but the extremely TLDR version is that Radical 6 initially spread after a test project for a Mars colony that was run in the Nevada desert somehow went very, very wrong in a way that I don't even know how they managed to do it, and the virus spread from there. The main symptoms of the virus include, among other things, an insatiable desire to kill yourself and just a general sense of doom and hopelessness. So once it spread globally, it caused a calamity that eventually led terrorists to blow up a bunch of annihilation reactors, basically like a super nuclear reactor, and causing an apocalypse in the process. Sigma and Phi need to send their current selves back in time to prevent that from happening, by infiltrating the decom facility, figuring out what happened, and changing the past so that Radical 6 never gets out. Virtue's Last Reward is legitimately a really good game. Like, of the games in this series, I can't stress it enough, it is the one that I recommend the most, it's the easiest to recommend, it's a good time. And I recommend 999 mostly because it makes VLR make a lot more sense. Honestly, VLR's biggest flaw is that it was followed up by one of the worst games I think I've ever played. That, it's time to move on to Chapter 2.3, Zero Time Dilemma. Up until this point, I have liked, if not loved, every game we've talked about. I also like, if not love, every single game we will talk about after this one. Even games where I've been mostly critical, like Killing Harmony and 999, I still recommend them to people and I still had a good time. I'd still say they were good games. Keep that in mind when I say that Zero Time Dilemma is a legitimately awful game that's so bad that it kinda contaminates its whole series, and we're just mostly gonna be talking about what makes it suck so hard. First of all, let's talk about the decision game. Unlike in the previous games, the 9 participants have been split into 3 separate teams named after their leaders. C Team features Carlos, Junpei, and Akane. D Team features Diana, Sigma, and Phi. Q Team features Q, Eric, and Mira. This is the only game so far to not include Clover, and at this point I kinda have to apologize to Clover because it turns out she's not the common denominator of these games having problems. This game is the only one where the rules necessitate death from the start. The only way to escape is for 6 code words to be input into the door, and the only way to unlock a code word is for another player to die. In other words, you can't get out unless at least 6 people are dead. You also can't just use your Esper abilities to get out if you have them. Certain words only work in certain timelines, so you can't pull 3 words from timeline X and 3 more from timeline Y to escape. The quote-unquote decision game itself revolves around, at least in theory, decisions. At the start, each of the 3 teams needs to vote for another team to be executed. If any team receives 2 votes, they'll be killed off right at the jump. Players try to coordinate a plan to all vote in a circle, meaning, one team votes for another team, that team votes for the third team votes for the first team. That way, everyone only gets 1 vote and nobody dies. But even if you do that with all 3 teams, the game will still show you some, but not all, of the routes where one team betrayed the others, even if that is literally impossible because you didn't do that. This was my experience. I voted to work together in the first round with every team, and then I didn't know what was going on. After that vote, the decisions usually come down to a life or death decision after completing an escape room. For example, at the end of the incinerator, Phi is locked in the incinerator, Sigma is locked in a torture chair, and Diana has to choose whether or not to pull the trigger of a revolver pointed at Sigma. It's got a 50-50 chance of firing a blank, but whether it fires a blank or a real bullet, it will deactivate the incinerator and free Phi. Meaning that, 50-50 chance of Sigma dying, 100% chance of Phi dying if you don't pull the trigger. 100% chance of her surviving if you do. And this kinda is why the game sucks. Namely, the decisions are never actual real decisions for the most part. In this room, you're kind of making a choice, but also not really. It's not really a choice, not an informed decision, because the outcome changes each time you do it, even if you don't do anything else differently. The first time you pull the trigger, you fire a blank. The second time you pull the trigger, it's a real bullet. In another room, there's a time where a C team needs to roll 3 dice and get all 1s in order to avoid being gunned down. And the decision is just rolling the dice. A decision you can't refuse to make, but which you have no control over. Like, it's just stupid. Overwhelmingly, the decisions in the decision game are things beyond your control at best, or just inane and stupid at worst. And this isn't by accident. A major theme of the game is, theoretically, that life's not fair. It's giving Naomi Smalls. And you know what? Fine. If this was a story told in any other medium, that might work. But unfortunately, this is a video game that we are playing, and where it's not fair to us, the players, not just the participants. In the Nonary game and the Ambidex game, your choices mattered. Your input into what should or shouldn't happen had a direct influence on the outcome. In the Ambidex game in particular, you had to build trust with other characters, and if you chose to be an asshole, or I don't know, maybe you were just in a timeline where someone else chose to be an asshole, people's trust won't be there. They'll betray you to protect themselves, and you'll get mad at the character for betraying you, but not the game. The game didn't screw you over. In the decision game, you're often just left to brute force it in a way that makes it miserable and unfun, where you're just like, cool, how many more times do I have to roll these dice before I stop getting Gatling gun death? Like... The second thing is that this game relies way too much on its returning cast, often to the detriment of literally everyone, including them. D-Team is completely dominated by Sigma and Phi, while C-Team is similarly dominated by Junpei and Akane. D-Team is the only team that was even remotely tolerable to be around, with Sigma and Phi being competent, and Diana just being treated as wallpaper for the most part. C-Team is constantly drowning under the weight of Junpei's moody bullshit, where he's this obnoxious, annoying brat about fucking everything, and also this game turns Akane into an unhinged lunatic along the lines of Clover in her 999 axe ending. Multiple times, she just like loses her mind and goes apeshit on Carlos. Part of what made VLR work so well was that you got to see everyone interacting with everyone else, so even though they were returning players, they weren't able to take over the narrative too much. But in Zero Time Dilemma, that's all that happens with 2 of the 3 teams, and it makes both of them feel like wasted opportunities. And you might think that what I'm saying here is that Q Team is the best team kind of by process of elimination, and you would be wrong. Very, very wrong. Eric alone is the worst character in this entire fucking franchise by such a large margin that it's borderline impressive that they managed to come up with him. And he alone made me want to actually stop playing this game a lot. If I didn't have to play it for this video, I probably would have. Mira is kind of fun, but she 1000% loses the matchup against Lotus and Alice, and she's clearly meant to be this game's version of them. And Q... You know what? Fuck it. Let's talk about the worst part of this game, because I am still mad about it. This game is brain dead in terms of its twists. If you thought any other game so far had moon logic, let me just recalibrate your expectations by telling you that this game has literal alien technology as the world's most insane, unhinged, unexplainable, unexplained, at least no real attempt to explain it was made, Deus Ex Machina. As you play through the game, you'll eventually discover that there's a teleportation room, or more accurately, it's like a fax machine but across time. The Germans found it in Antarctica in like 1888, I think, and held on to it until after World War II, meaning that the Nazis canonically had alien time teleportation technology in this universe, after which point the US government took possession. Then, the mastermind of this game Zero, just... I don't know, just bought it, I guess, and set it up here in DCOM. I'm sure the US government would be very willing to give up its technology like that. Up to 2 people can be sent to a different point in time, or a different timeline altogether. But the machines take about 10 months to recharge. And you might be thinking like, hey, 10 months, that sounds like a really specific amount of time. Almost like the perfect amount of time for 2 people to spend a month getting to know each other, maybe courting a little bit, before getting pregnant and having twins to send back in time. And you would be correct to think that. In the route where Phi gets melted in the incinerator, Mira decides to escape by herself, and Sigma and Diana are stuck in the facility. They fall in love after Sigma mansplains Diana's abusive husband to her, and then they sleep together while she's like fall down drunk. Then she gets pregnant and gives birth to twins. I'm not making any of this up. It's so fucking frustrating when you're playing through it. There's a boy named Delta and a girl named Phi. They send them both back to Germany in the early 1900s. But then it turns out that the Germans also teleported baby Phi up to 2004, meaning that there are 3 separate instances of Phi that exist. The one who's a baby in DCOM in 2029, the one in Germany in 1904, and the one in the US in 2004. The second version also apparently just has like this super long lifespan now for reasons that aren't explained, and actually raised the 3rd version of Phi, and then also the 3rd version of Phi is the one in the games, meaning that Sigma is her dad, and Luna, the robot from VLR, is just a robot that Sigma built of his baby mama from another timeline. I'm going to commit a felony. Uchikoshi, you will pay for your crimes. He hits on Phi so much in VLR, like it's fucking awful.
To choose, Carlos. You are that solitary snail. The fate of the world rests on your decision.
It's red.
Sorry. It's just, holy shit, it's so bad. This alien teleporting bullshit is used as a Deus Ex Machina in the worst imaginable way. But that's not even all. Remember how I said there were only 9 players in the game, and one of them is like this little kid named Q? Well, what if I told you that Q actually refers to a secret 10th person who's been there the whole fucking time that just no one's ever really acknowledged properly? And look, I want to be clear, there are defenders of this game, for reasons unknown to me, who will be like, but they sneakily alluded to that extra person being there a few times. Those people are fucking coping. I am so sorry if you think that this twist was anything other than the most contrived, brain-dead, jump-the-shark moment that this series has ever had, potentially that any game has ever had. The only thing I can say to you is that I hope your lobotomy scars are healing well. This wheelchair man is actually Q, who the players all knew about despite never explicitly acknowledging him and always referring to the child as Q. Turns out the kid was actually a robot, and he was basically treated like he was, I don't know, Q's interpreter? Liaison? It's some bullshit. The hints towards his existence are extremely minimal and don't make sense, really. You can allegedly hear a 4th body hit the ground in certain situations when Q-Team gets knocked out, despite the fact that the man's in a wheelchair, like why is he falling on the ground? Or you can hear his scream when they get melted in the acid shower together. There's also a point where you can kill him during a Mexican standoff in the library, but only if you know his real name. And do you know what that real name is? It's Delta. Yes, the secret old wheelchair man is actually also Phi's twin brother, specifically the version that was sent back to 1904. While Phi was gifted with the ability to become an Esper for reasons unknown, Delta, for reasons that are honestly somehow even more unknown, gained the unique ability to mind hack people, and I wish I was making that up, that is what it is canonically called. He can't jump timelines like the other Espers can, but he can read people's minds, and occasionally he can basically just use the Force to control their bodies and like make them kill each other. Decision game, everyone. You get so many decisions. It's your choice. You're making the decisions. Oh, right. He's also this game's Zero and set up the whole thing because he had to set it up, because it was necessary for the events of Virtue's Last Reward, which were in turn necessary for Sigma to be sent back in time, which was necessary so that Sigma would sleep with Diana and conceive Delta and Phi, and then send them back in time so that Delta could be born. There are, like, at least 6 different time paradoxes created by this, and they're not even fun to talk about. It's just frustrating. Like, I can't overstate this enough. It is the worst fucking twist to get to at the end of the game. I felt like I could feel my brain melting out of my ears when I got there, especially because you can tell they felt like they were being so clever pulling the rug out from under the player. Zero Escape always has 9 players, and before somebody says, actually the Zero of Zero Time Dilemma never explicitly says there are only 9 players, I'm gonna point out the actual Steam page where the description opens with 9 participants awaken trapped in an underground facility. The robot kid, his name is Sean by the way, we're going to be calling him that going forward, is treated as a participant and is clearly framed as Q throughout the entire game. Where Carlos and Diana's portraits are shown as the leaders of C and D team respectively, Sean is shown as the leader of Q team. And the devs have argued, and the defenders have argued, that the reason you don't see Delta ever is because he's the point of view for the player. Which, again, is bullshit. For one, in the library, we literally climb a spiral staircase that his wheelchair straight up could never get up, given its tight turns and the fact that, it's a staircase, he's in a wheelchair. And also, the camera bobs like someone walking upstairs, not like somebody rolling up them or bumping up them one by one. For another, there is no dispute that Diana and Carlos are the player character on the other teams, and yet that never prevents them from being seen on screen or being acknowledged. God, this game is just so fucking dumb. Oh, also, Delta seemingly invented Radical 6, and the way it spreads is that Mira steals a vial of it and injects Phi with it after D-Team uses a bomb to escape, turning Phi into Patient Zero and kicking off the events of Virtue's Last Reward. Also, I didn't mention it before, but Akane's backstory does involve both of her parents dying in a car crash when she was a child, and then she was raised by her brother, who we know mostly as Santa. Or I should say, after this game, it used to involve that. That has now been retconned. What actually happened is that Mira is a serial killer who rips out people's hearts to feel love. Because sure, why not? She killed her first victim in a park somewhere, and then Akane's dad was wrongfully convicted of that killing. He was executed, and Akane's mother killed herself out of grief, shame, whatever else, and Akane was just lied to about it. Great. Like, this super genius, this person who has orchestrated all of this stuff, like, never Googled her dad's name or anything, like, never looked that up, never thought to, like, investigate that more. Like, she's caught completely off guard. The reason why Delta decided to stick with this whole life's not fair ethos is apparently the taxi that Akane's dad had called was then taken by a doctor who was supposed to cure a sick child in a nearby hospital. However, the taxi was then in a terrible accident, killing the doctor and subsequently dooming the child. And that child's name was Sean. Sean died, and his best friend, Delta, for some fucking reason, decided to immortalize him as a bunch of headless robots. From what I can remember, this is actually kind of just like incidental to the rest of the story. Like, Delta would have needed to do the whole decom thing regardless, so adding this bullshit in doesn't really do anything of value. Also, he's mad at Mira for causing the domino effect that killed Sean, so he kind of just also uses her for, like, general all-purpose chaos. She's not knocked out while the other participants are, so she'll occasionally just go around murdering people. She was the one who killed Junpei in the route where Akane goes apeshit with a chainsaw on Carlos, by the way, but eventually Delta kills her in at least some timelines as, like, revenge? Or just because, like, she's no longer necessary? I don't know. Oh, also, remember how in 999 and VLR it was, like, a really rare, difficult skill to be able to timeline hop? Now, it wasn't, like, easy to learn, and the entire story of Virtue's Last Reward is literally just an effort to teach that skill to Sigma and Phi. That's out the window now. Now, it's about as easy as getting your learner's permit in Alberta. Carlos learns it, and then it turns out it's contagious, so you can just literally know how to do it if you're around enough people who also know how to do it. So, in the final ending of the game, they kill Delta, and all escape to the beginning of the game when they won a coin toss and escaped that way. This is, frankly, grossly oversimplifying how stupid the ending is, because I can't. I don't want to talk about that. It's so bad. I don't know, we need to move on with this video soon, so let's just quickly hammer home why this game's storytelling just sucks ass. For one, it's completely impossible to figure out what any sort of a coherent timeline is. Despite it literally being a decision game, the game will sometimes ignore your decisions altogether for literally no reason. It'll act like you've betrayed people when you never did, or it won't acknowledge a betrayal for some weird reason, meaning that crucial fragments won't unlock for you when they should, like it did for me. There were some fragments that, like, I'd made all of the choices in that voting section and for whatever reason just didn't play the cutscene. Unlike the other games, you don't progress through a timeline one piece at a time or in order. You're given a stack of random fragments to select from with no indication of where they fit in the timeline until you've completed them. It's so frustrating, and it makes the decisions feel pointless because you don't know what's going on or what the context of that decision is, unlike in every other game where you knew your decisions would have consequences and you knew you'd have to follow up on them. And again, I know that that's what the point of the game was, that there's all of this random stuff happening, the characters don't know what's going on. It's a bad premise. Okay? This isn't a game that you could have redeemed by just, like, maybe writing it a little bit better. The premise is fundamentally flawed. The second thing I want to talk about in terms of, like, the storytelling being bad is that it's just a horrendously tasteless game. It's gruesome and bloody and uncomfortable in ways that the other games rarely were. Like, the ninth man's death in 999 is deliberately brutal and over the top, but in Zero Time Dilemma, that's the norm. Characters will get dismembered on screen or have their throats slit live, and blood will be gushing and there will be these gurgling screams. When Mira rips out Eric's heart, you have to hear more than a minute of these gruesome squelching noises as she roots around in his chest cavity for his heart. There is a whole timeline where each team has to press a button to melt the other teams with acid, and you will have to hear every single person who dies that way scream in agony as their flesh is melted from their bones. When Eric details his father's abuse in the past, the game plays like cartoonish punching noises to indicate when he beats his children. It is fucking tasteless in a way that even NetherRealm Studios would look at and go like, hey, that's a bit much for what you're trying to do here, you maybe could tone it down a bit. The third and most important issue with this game's storytelling, what dooms it from the start, is that it desperately wants to be clever, and it just isn't. There is a gap the size of the Grand fucking Canyon between how clever Zero Time Dilemma thinks it is and how clever it actually is. It's the goddamn Shane Dawson documentary of video games. It sucks. It tries twist after twist that suck, retconning anything good from the past games and making them actively worse in the process. Nothing good comes from retconning Phi as Sigma's time-hopping daughter, or Luna as Sigma's attempt to recreate his lover as a robot, or Akane's backstory, or any of that other shit. Delta's existence is nothing but a bottomless sea of plot holes, because he's now also the cult leader who sent Dio to mess up the Ambidex game and all this other shit, and it's just... I hate it. It's the worst. You're making the same mistake Killing Harmony made, but to a far worse degree, and with even worse results, with characters that I don't know how anyone likes these characters at the end of this game, like, good god. And look, I know I said at the start that this video isn't just a review of these games or whatever, but genuinely, just don't buy this game. Don't even bother watching a playthrough. If you've played the first 2 games, great. Let the story end with VLR. Leaving on a cliffhanger is infinitely better. If I hadn't had to finish playing this game to make this video, I would have dropped this game after going through the library with the U-Team, and I'm not joking. Like, save yourself the headache. Spend your money on something better.
Let us begin. This is the Decision Game, a game of fate. The lives of you, me, and the human race hang in the balance.
Chapter 2.4 Final Thoughts on Zero Escape. Zero Escape struggles with a way more complicated premise than any of the other games in this video, really, particularly as the premise keeps changing from game to game. Honestly, the whole series probably would have been better if it was just always the Ambidex game format. The Nonary game format was kind of tedious and overwrought, and the Decision game format was narratively and ludologically miserable. The problem with trying to tell unhinged stories is that you have to juggle a lot to get there. You have to be able to keep people up to date with the premise, you have to keep enforcing it throughout. With something like Danganronpa, this comes relatively easily because it more organically slots into the narrative. With something like Zero Escape, it's a lot more convoluted and risks running the game's narrative into the ground. This is particularly notable with 999, where character development is often the biggest victim of the game's need to force its premise out there. Virtue's Last Reward demonstrates the importance of giving your complicated premise a lot of time and space to be explained and explored, and using the breathing room that affords to develop your characters, explain their motives, and give you a reason to give a shit about any of them. It sets up its twist with enough time that you know what it's talking about when it brings up Radical 6, or the Myrmidons, or whatever else. Zero Time Dilemma shows why it's important to actually understand how to tell a story with the goal of, I don't know, telling the story, not just trying to outsmart your audience. Overall, Zero Escape is a franchise that shows the heights that unhinged stories can reach as well as the lows, how well you can handle a branching narrative with timeline hopping and sci-fi nonsense, and how poorly you can handle it. That being said, we're now going to move on to the next series, also a non-linear story, also written and directed by Uchikoshi. Chapter 3.0 I, the Somnium Files. I, the Somnium Files and its sequel, I, the Somnium Files nirvanA Initiative, are 2 of my favorite games in a long time. There are 2 main things to keep in mind about these games. The first is that the playable character always has an AI ball eyeball in place of their left eye. This serves as their companion throughout the game, helping them to use certain special abilities like thermal vision and zooming in, as well as being the avatar you use in Somniums. Speaking of Somniums, that's the other thing. When investigating a crime, you can use the sync machine to explore someone's dreams, or their Somniums. Depending on how you solve the Somnium, you'll end up going down different branching paths. The machine also has a 6-minute time limit, although time does slow to a crawl whenever you're not moving, so you have time to think. It's basically Superhot meets Persona meets Zero Escape, and it works just shockingly well. Also, for simplicity's sake, we're going to refer to the first game in the series as I, the Somnium Files, and the sequel as nirvanA Initiative, because otherwise this is just going to get confusing. Chapter 3.1 I, the Somnium Files. In the first game in the series, released in September of 2019, you play as Kaname Date, a detective in the Advanced Brain Investigation Squad, BIS. Your boss is Boss, your partner is Aiba, your gay bestie is Pewter, and the kid who lives with you because her parents suck and are terrible is Mizuki. The game kicks off with Mizuki, who's 12, and her friend Oda, who's in his mid-20s, which, side note, fuck Oda, discovering that Mizuki's mother Shoko Nadami had been murdered in a park. Her eye had been gouged out, and an ice pick had been left in the empty eye socket. Mizuki, panicking, took it out of her eye. The first proper Somnium in the game is trying to figure out what happened from Mizuki, and depending on your choices, the plot immediately diverges significantly. One branch of the story features the new Cyclops serial killer as he mows his way through a whole horde of victims. The other doesn't involve any killings after Shoko, kind of. You'd think that creating such a massive divergence point in a narrative like this would leave one side or the other feeling unfulfilling or unsatisfying, but it really doesn't. Somnium Files does a good job of balancing both narratives and handling the different characters in each one. When it comes to unhinged storytelling, I think one of the biggest things you can take away from I, the Somnium Files is how important it is to develop a cast of characters to carry your story. Visually, the character design is really solid, with characters having distinct silhouettes, unique color palettes, and just a general strong visual identity. You rarely are going to forget an important character, except for... shit, what's his name?
Wow, I never thought a great detective like you would ask me my name. It's Kagami, sir. It's Kagami, sir. Kagami. Are you serious? It's Kagami!
Konami? I think it's Konami. The voice acting in this game is tremendous too, with everyone knocking it out of the park, but especially Allegra Clark, because her as Boss, good fucking god. Later, we're going to go into a little bit of her best work in the game, but we'll get there when we get there. The game also does a tremendous job with establishing the characters' personalities, not just in isolation, but also in their relationships to one another. Date would probably honestly be a pretty obnoxious protagonist if not for the genuinely really fun dynamic he has with Aiba, Mizuki, all these other characters who he gets some really good banter with. Iris is a great character, in particular because of how she proves pretty early on she's not just some, half-assed caricature of an internet idol. She's genuinely really clever and knows how to take advantage of how people perceive her. Mizuki is easily one of the best characters in the entire series, in large part because she's not just mindlessly snarky. She's not just, angsty little girl for the sake of being an angsty little girl. She has layers depending on who she's with, and she saves her best roasts for Date. The game uses its branching narratives to put the spotlight on a lot of different characters, with Iris, Oda, Mizuki, and more all getting their time in the spotlight. It's not just the main characters or even like the, secondary but still pretty important characters who are given the spotlight either. Mama and Pewter are easily some of my favorite characters in the game despite being pretty minor, because every time you see them, they're interacting with these other strong characters and have their own excellent dynamics with them. It's also not the main point, but it is kind of worth acknowledging that this game handles its queer characters shockingly well. When Mama was first introduced, I was genuinely worried she was about to be treated as the butt of the joke. Instead, honestly, she feels like a bit of a love letter to queer fans. Like, she's basically just hornier Delta work. It's amazing. The other important thing is that these aren't just, theoretically good characters, or characters with potential that might ultimately be left on the table. Somnium Files' strength comes from being able to recognize when they have a moment to capitalize on the strength of their characters and the performers behind them. Ota, while being an annoying little brat, does have a genuinely moving arc in the game as you learn more about his family. It doesn't make you like him more, arguably it makes you like him less, but it makes you absolutely fall to pieces over his adorable mother who is clearly just trying her best. Iris's arc reveals a lot about her character and recontextualizes pretty much your entire experience with her. The Annihilation end, which is easily the worst outcome for the characters, is an incredible reveal. Not just because it's a really, really good twist, but because Allegra Clark absolutely obliterates the performance. Again, spoilers from here on out if you want to play this game and you haven't already. A, you should. B, this is where we're going to start talking about the real spoilers.
The left eye socket is vacant. Victim has had her left eyeball removed.
Her left eye?
The most likely scenario is that the killer or killers removed it.
Well, we don't know that for sure. A crow or some other animal could have pulled it off the corpse.
Impossible. The amount of blood indicates that the victim's eye was removed before her death.
So, if you follow the serial killer arc, TLDR, the serial killer is actually Saito Sejima, the son of Senator So Sejima. He commits the killings by using a second secret sync machine to swap bodies. Remember, if you stay in a Somnium for more than 6 minutes, you've been told by this point that something bad will happen, but it turns out that you haven't been told the full story. In fact, what'll happen is that you'll swap bodies with the other person if given enough time. At the start of the game, he had already swapped into Shoko's body. From there, he swapped into Renju, then killed Shoko's body with Renju's mind trapped inside. After that, he just leapfrogged through the rest of his victims, jumping from Renju to Iris, from Iris to Sosejima, and then finally from So to Boss, which is where you've caught him. When you first arrest Boss, Allegra Clark is in her usual Boss voice, but once you make the accusation, Saito drops the facade, and Allegra changes up her entire cadence to match his. It's a brilliant moment. Honestly, I can't even really explain it in a way that'll do justice. I'm just going to show you a bit of it.
Yes. You. The person in front of me right now.
You're blaming the commander of Abyss for this?
No, not Boss. The person inside Boss's head.
Can you at least try to make sense?
Alright, I'll explain. Your imitation of Boss was perfect.
Yes, there's a reason for that. Let me define some terms first. A person's memory and sense of self. Let's call that personality. It isn't quite the right word, but it'll suffice. Now, transferring that personality into someone else's brain, let's call that parasitism. The one transferring is the parasite, the one being transferred into is the host. Are you with me so far? Moving on. Even after the personality exchange is complete, the host's memory isn't completely lost. About 1% remains in the brain. So, a parasite could use that 1% to imitate the language and behavior of the host.
This game's story is great, I'm not trying to say that it isn't, and its characters individually are also pretty good, but The game as a whole is definitely better than the sum of its parts, and it gets there off the backs of those brilliant characters and their brilliant relationships. If there's one thing I think that you can take away from the Somnium Files in terms of unhinged storytelling, it's how well it uses its characters, both as individuals and as social creatures with dynamic, often complicated relationships to one another, to build a narrative that pulls you in a lot further than I think it otherwise would. It's a fine story by itself, but when you compare it to Uchikoshi's last series, Zero Escape, it feels like there was a real attempt to do better with the characters more than anything else, and it paid off. The most noticeable difference is honestly with the playable characters, Date and Aiba. Their dynamic is handled really, really well. It would have been really easy for this whole thing to come across as annoying, but their banter is great for maintaining the game's tone as it violently swings back and forth between being funny, being horny, and being horrifying in terms of some pretty gruesome murders you have to try and solve. When you're telling unhinged stories, it can be easy for characters to kind of get lost along the way, or for the game's tone to get away from you as you try to hit your marks. The Somnium Files is an excellent example of how well it pays off to refocus your energy on your characters and their relationships with one another, and how much more room it gives you to build an engaging universe.
Hey, whoever's in there, stay back! Mizuki!
However, this game didn't end in the Somnium Files. It didn't end with figuring out who was the Cyclops killer. It moved on to the next story, which was Chapter 3.2, the Somnium Files nirvanA Initiative. In nirvanA Initiative, released in June of 2022, you play through two separate timelines with two separate characters, Mizuki Date and Kuruto Ryuki. Mizuki is, obviously, a returnee from the previous game, and if you're paying attention, you might have noticed that Mizuki has now officially been adopted by Kaname after the deaths of her parents. Aiba has also had a bit of a dispute with Kaname and fled his eye socket for Mizuki, who's become a part of Abyss as an adult. Ryuki is a new character, but more importantly, he is definitely Kaname Date's boyfriend as far as I am concerned. While Mizuki gets Aiba, Ryuki gets a brand new AI companion, Tama. Instead of the spider-webbing branching narrative from the first game, the sequel follows two much more linear timelines. One happening in the present day of the game, where you play as Mizuki, and one happening 6 years prior, where you play as Ryuki. Now, nirvanA Initiative has a really tough task ahead of it, in a lot of the same ways that both Danganronpa 2 Goodbye Despair and Zero Escape Virtue's Last Reward had. Namely, how do you continue the narrative when the story has been pretty definitively wrapped up? How do you justify extending the premise? How do you make the premise satisfying once people know the gimmick? I mean, after all, a big part of what makes the story of the Somnium Files work is that you don't know the body swapping gimmick. Once you know it, can you tell another story with that gimmick? On top of that, the original game was hugely character focused. What are you going to do with all those characters? Well, this is the first thing I want to talk about in terms of this game's storytelling. It doesn't really bother with the previous premise, focusing instead on telling a new story with new in-universe mechanics and mostly the same characters. Body swapping isn't a part of this game's story, and the characters don't spend a ton of time trying to explain why. They just move on and tell their new story. This game focuses on the half-body serial killings, a series of murders where the victims' bodies were found sliced perfectly in half, starting off right out of the gate with Mizuki discovering the left half of the corpse of Jin Furuway in the middle of a nearby stadium. The strangest part of it all? The right half of Jin's body had initially been found 6 years earlier in an incident at a local television studio where Mizuki, Ryuki, Boss, Minecraft Steve's ugly brother, and a bunch of others had been gathered for a game show. The right half had exploded at the time, but it had also come with a sign stuck through it with a QR code that led to a mysterious, unsettling video that was rumored to have a secret message hidden somewhere inside it. The initial investigation 6 years earlier had been led by Ryuki, while the present-day investigation is run by Mizuki. The divergence point comes pretty early in the game, after Mizuki enters Ryuki's Somnium to try and learn more, leading to you playing through Ryuki's story in order to learn enough information to play through Mizuki's. At the start of the game, Ryuki is also clearly going through it. The man is struggling over something involving the half-body case, and has apparently spent the better part of the last 6 years as a barely functioning alcoholic. However, at no point does body swapping enter the equation here. The sync machines both still exist, and you actually use both of them over the course of nirvanA Initiative, but the old scheme is dropped. Not just that, but just about the entire cast makes a comeback at one point or another too, although a lot of effort has been made to ensure that they're the characters you loved throughout the last game, not necessarily what they ended up as.
That's...
You recognize him?
Yeah, I'm sure of it. I'll never forget. It's... the left half of his body. His name is Jin Furue. I remember it clearly. 6 years ago, at Studio Devaita.
All right, now that Mr. Ryuki is away, let's get back to it, shall we? Here we go, next question. Which Taoist symbol, shaped like interlocking black and white commas, represents the origin of all things?
What the? A blackout?
What are you standing around for? Get the lights!
Yeah, I'm on it!
Date is technically back in his original body, but he's had a mask made to resemble what he looked like throughout the first game. Cuter is back despite canonically being criminally charged for aiding and abetting the man who possessed his secret gay lover, thanks to Boss's intervention. Iris has been cured of the brain tumor that was threatening to kill her and is back to being an internet idol, none the wiser to the mysteries of her parentage that were revealed at the end of the last game. Ota now runs Matsushita Diner, Sosajima has quietly retired, Mama is now a psychic still tending bar at Golden Marble, Boss still runs Abyss, Aiba is still her usual self even now that she's with Mizuki, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, the story of nirvanA Initiative, as well as its themes, is a distinct story, and that's really valuable for the game itself and the franchise. One of the challenges that Danganronpa and Zero Escape both face is that there's a law of diminishing returns in terms of how many times you can execute the same basic premise before you're just jumping the shark. And Somnium Files kind of protects itself from that by making it clear that the game isn't about the new Cyclops serial killer or the body swapping or even really about any individual character. It's about the characters as a group and the stories that they can tell with each other. It reinforces that the actual gimmick of Somnium Files is the sync machine and the Somniums themselves, but that even they still primarily exist as a way to tell the stories of the characters, rather than as the framework the characters exist within themselves. The second thing I want to praise about nirvanA Initiative is how it handles its twist, because it's really cleverly done. The structure of nirvanA Initiative's timeline has seemed borderline boring in terms of how straightforward it is. Aside from one branching path for Ryuki, the first 2/3 of the game are pretty linear, especially compared to the Somnium Files. However, at the start of Mizuki's 5th chapter, you start out interacting with Mama directly as she goes through the case with you, the player. It's been extremely puzzling up to this point. Like, you keep finding half of one body 6 years ago in Ryuki's timeline, then the other half in the present day. The bodies never look like they've decayed or rotted, and the time of death always seems like very recent. Mama leads you, the player, through the case as you try to figure out what the game's twist is. And eventually, you can only come to a single conclusion. The timeline that you've been operating off of is misleading you. When you were playing as Ryuki, you weren't just playing him in the past. On February 12th and February 14th in-game, you were playing as him in the present day. On the flip side, when you were playing through the Mizuki route, you were actually playing Mizuki 6 years in the past on those days. Except, wait, no, hold on. Mizuki doesn't lose her eye until the end of the explosion route in the past. That was when, her socket opened up so she could have Aiba. She couldn't have done that before. Also, she was 12 during that timeline. What's happening? Well, it turns out Mizuki's adopted. Not by Date, but, originally adopted. As is Mizuki. The Mizuki that we know, Mizuki Date, was adopted by Shoko and Renju from an orphanage, with Mizuki herself being the clone of the original Mizuki, who was eventually adopted by Boss and now goes by Mizuki Kuranushi. For our purposes, we're going to refer to Mizuki Kuranushi by her in-game nickname, Bibi, and Mizuki Date as just Mizuki. Both of them were part of the human experiments carried out at the Horodori Institute, which is where they get their supernatural strength from. When you were playing Mizuki's route on the 12th and 14th, you were playing as Bibi, but she didn't suddenly disappear in the present timeline either. Instead, she shows up as the Masked Woman, a mysterious character who makes her introduction by shooting at Mizuki at the very beginning of the game. It's definitely not like a simple twist to wrap your head around in terms of the logistics involved, but at its core, it's very simple. It relies on you trusting the game when it shows you the timeline, because even though it doesn't always reveal the full length of a route in one of these games, you've always been able to trust it to accurately define the order of events. By keeping the narrative relatively simple up until now in terms of its structure, it manages to pull the rug out from under you while still keeping it digestible. By only having to manage 2 core routes, the game doesn't have to worry about juggling an impossible number of experiences. And by separating those 2 core routes between 2 distinct characters, it makes it a lot easier to make it work without having to bullshit the player too hard. The twist makes the player reevaluate their entire experience so far, and how the universe of the game isn't all it appears to be. It brings the cult of Nysa's beliefs into a new light, as you realize that there might actually be something to their argument that the world is nothing but a simulation. The game's programmers aren't just playing with the characters, but are playing with you, the player. When it comes to telling unhinged stories, I think there are really two strong takeaways from nirvanA Initiative. The first is to recognize that you don't have to engage with every single element of a prior story when you're telling its sequel. And I think that's especially important because of how quickly all the unhinged shit can pile up if you're trying to tell a whole bunch of these stories. To be clear, I'm not saying that you have to abandon everything either, but there are times where a better story can be told if you're willing to close the book on certain elements of the last story. And knowing what to carry with you and what to leave in the past is a lot more challenging than it seems. The second is that sometimes less is more. A clever, relatively minor twist can do more to impact how players perceive your story than trying to trick them with this big elaborate conspiracy. There are plenty of narrative twists in nirvanA Initiative, but the big twist for the player is learning that the timelines weren't represented accurately, something relatively small that allows for some really cool storytelling. In a way, both of these fall under the category of having some restraint when it comes to your storytelling. Sure, it can be fun to play a game where the story is at full throttle 24/7 with surprises and twists and reveals, but, well, it's also fun to play a game that can catch you with a knife in the ribs when you least expect it. Chapter 3.3. Final thoughts on the Somnium Files. Ultimately, I think this is just a really solid series. It plays with some really cool concepts, but it doesn't let them stick around for too long. It brings in a huge cast of great characters, and it uses them to really solid effect by capitalizing on their relationships with one another to tell greater stories. The writers really know where to draw the line between poking fun at their characters and laughing with them, rather than pointing and laughing at them. I mean, I know I bring it back to Mama a lot because she's my favorite character, but she's a really good example of this. She's never mocked for being gender fluid, or queer, or fat, or anything else. Everyone in the game loves Mama, and they all respect her. She's not just the punching bag of the cast, nor is she some tragic figure. It's a series that shows how telling an unhinged story doesn't require the most batshit moon logic twists to be exciting and thrilling too. I mean, sure, it has a lot of those, but the subtle, clever twists are what really make the games great, whether it's stuff like Renju's relationship with Pewter in the Somnium Files, or the fact that the timelines are wrong in nirvanA Initiative. Those are the twists that can really stick with you. Anyways, if you haven't played these games yet, I am very sorry that you've been spoiled on some of it, but I can guarantee I've left out enough details that you would still absolutely enjoy the ride. Anyways, enough babbling about this series, we've already been here for too long. It's time to move on to the last game we have to talk about today. Chapter 4.0, Master Detective Archives Rain Code. Thankfully, there's only one game in this series, so we can do it pretty quickly. Also, we are just going to be calling it Rain Code from here on out because, come on, that's a mouthful. The game released on June 30th, 2023 for the Nintendo Switch as a console exclusive, and will be receiving 4 pieces of story-related DLC in the coming month. First of those DLC pieces has already been released, but it's not going to be included here because, I mean, we're focusing on the main story, we're not talking about DLC. In Rain Code, you play as Yuma Cocohead, a detective, maybe, with amnesia, who's apparently been ordered to take the train to Kanai Ward to investigate something there. On the train, he meets his fellow master detectives, all of whom are immediately a little bit suspicious that something is afoot. And turns out, might have been with good reason. The detectives also reveal that they come with some special abilities. They can use radar, they can hear real good, they can use a Snapchat image thing through their eye. They've got Google Glass, I don't know what's up with that guy. Anyways, soon Yuma gets knocked unconscious, and then wakes up to find the dog boy on fire with a knife in his chest, followed by the charred remains of the other detectives. Yuma solves the case with the aid of Shinigami, a death god who he has apparently signed a pact with, who can access mystery labyrinths in order to find out who the true culprit, or in some cases culprits, are. Once they've deduced who done it, the guilty party will suddenly drop dead, with Shinigami reaping their souls. After arriving properly in Kanai Ward, you're introduced to the actual main cast of the game. The rest of the game will involve one mystery per chapter, and you'll be accompanied by a different detective for each one. The game is, kinda open world in the sense that there are some side missions, but they're largely inconsequential. You can find Shinigami statues around the map that'll unlock your memories with other detectives and advance those relationships, but ultimately there's not that much to do in the open world besides just run to the next objective. The detectives are all trying to uncover the ultimate mystery of Kanai Ward, all the while trying to stay safe from the evil peacekeepers, the private police force of the colossal megacorporation that runs the city, Amaterasu. Rain Code is a game that leans really heavily on its relationship to Danganronpa, both in terms of its structure and its visual design. The chapters have a similar structure to Danganronpa chapters. There's a similar number, and a lot of the mystery labyrinth structure and minigames are very similar to class trials. The music has a very Danganronpa vibe. The characters are designed by Rui Komatsuzaki in the same style as his Danganronpa designs, and obviously the game maintains the pink blood from Danganronpa. In all the lead up to this game, they heavily hyped up the Danganronpa similarities, and honestly, that's what I want to focus on when we're talking about Rain Code, where those connections helped its story and where they hurt. So, first up, let's talk about where it works, namely the pink blood. And again, just like in the other ones I've tried to do anyways, this is your big spoiler warning for this game. If you plan on playing this, this is where you should tune out.
Dang it! I can't remember anything! Where am I? Who am I? Why can't I remember?
The single smartest thing that this game does is rely on your assumption that the pink blood is purely a stylistic thing. But is it? Early on in the game, if you're paying attention, Yuma cuts himself on a piece of glass, and his blood is red. In the Mystery Labyrinth, when Shinigami slices up Yuma to reveal a future pathway, the blood is also red. Going forward, the only people with pink blood are the residents of Kanai Ward, but no one ever really remarks on it. Why? Well, as the game advances, it turns out that the people of Kanai Ward aren't really people. They're homunculi, creatures created by Amaterasu and the unified government for the purpose of creating unstoppable killing machines. Not that they know about it, though. The joint cover-up is the ultimate mystery of Kanai Ward, and the residents have been fully misled into thinking they're still normal humans. They were created using the DNA of the people of Kanai Ward, and the new versions were pretty much identical to them in most regards, retaining their memories and general personality. However, if you cut one open, they'll bleed pink, a phenomenon that was explained to the residents of Kanai Ward as just being a consequence of the rain to keep the cover-up going. A big difference between them is that, once killed, they don't die. They reawaken as zombies who will mindlessly attack humans to eat their flesh. Without consuming human flesh, homunculi eventually get sick and permanently die, and also if they're exposed to sunlight, they will go absolutely feral. And that doesn't just apply to the ones who've died, or quote-unquote died. The reason for Kanai Ward's perpetual rain is to block out the sun. And the reason that meat buns are everywhere in Kanai Ward is that those are human flesh. Technically, none of the homunculi are cannibals since they're not technically humans, but I mean, well, Yuma and the other master detectives, Sans Yako, are still humans, and they did eat those meat buns. Whoops! It's a really clever twist that builds on the assumptions that players bring into the game based on their experience with past games, but it doesn't really take that too far. nirvanA Initiative did this really well with the timeline shifting, and Zero Time Dilemma did it really poorly with the Delta reveal, where the goal is to let the characters pull the wool over their own eyes by making assumptions without good reason. Part of why it worked for nirvanA Initiative, and I would argue Raincode, is that it keeps it subtle. It's the sort of thing that once it's revealed you think like, oh shit, that actually makes a lot of sense, but goddamn I was not gonna figure that out myself. It didn't for Zero Time Dilemma because it's just too much in every sense. It's too contrived, and it makes players feel like it not only makes even less sense than before, but also that they never had a chance in hell of figuring it out themselves. Raincode builds upon the fact that anyone playing the game is probably at least aware of Danganronpa and constantly reinforces that relationship through the rest of its visual design, audio, and structure. You never really think to question the pink blood because, like, of course it's pink blood. It's the style of these games. However, I do think the game's biggest weakness also comes from relying too much on the Danganronpa structure for a story that doesn't work for it. Chapters in those games are long and the trials are convoluted, but a big part of why it works is that the world is also really self-contained. When a murder happens in a Danganronpa game, the killer, victims, suspects, and jury are all pulled from a single, predefined, pre-established pool of characters with pre-existing relationships in a heavily restricted area. The game is limited to a relatively small number of chapters because of the nature of the killing game, but it also compensates by making each chapter really long, and using its chapters well. 50% of a Danganronpa chapter is the daily life, where you build relationships with characters, get to know them, all that good stuff. And the other 50% is the deadly life, the part where they exploit your personal feelings towards the rest of the cast to make sure you're personally invested in figuring out which one of your friends killed the others. The daily life sections are also, importantly, player-directed. You get to choose who you build your relationships with, and you aren't able to pick everyone. You have to choose someone over someone else, and that means that every player is going to have a different relationship to the cast than the others, and it gives players different approaches to deadly life sections. This doesn't work for Raincode. For most of the game, you have no pre-existing relationship to any of the culprits, you have no pre-existing relationship to any of the victims, and you don't know much about the pre-existing relationships between those characters. I would argue that the best chapter in the game is the second chapter, and I think that that's a pretty common opinion from what I've seen, and I think why it's so good is that it's not just a convoluted murder. It's really the only one where the culprits and victims have pre-existing relationships with one another that you get to know about. It's a complicated, messy case, made even more so by the fact that you get to know who all these girls are, or were in some cases, and why they're acting the way they're acting. It's not just that the other cases are bad in terms of the mysteries involved, because they aren't, but you kinda just don't care about the people involved in them. Like, okay, let's take a Danganronpa trial and imagine it played out in the same way. Imagine you rocked up to a high school as Detective Yuma Kokohead and found Chihiro strung up in the girls' locker room. Bloodlust written on the wall, everything else exactly the same as it was in the game, but you have not played through a full chapter and a half with all these characters by the time the body is discovered. Would you really care that much about the reveal of Toko as Genocide Jack? What about Byakuya's role in messing with the crime scene? Or the reveal that Chihiro was actually a boy? The reveal that Mondo killed him out of rage over Chihiro's ability to grow past the shame that he's being blackmailed over and be a bigger man than Mondo? Would you really give a shit about Kiyotaka's despair over his death? For unhinged storytelling to really work, you need to balance the time commitment with the emotional commitment. If you want to tell a story with a handful of huge chapters, you need to give people a reason to care that much about a single chapter. And Raincode really just doesn't. I was talking about this when I was playing through the game on stream, and someone mentioned that they actually liked that the game had more of a, monster of the week approach to storytelling. And the thing is, I kind of actually agree with that opinion. It isn't a bad idea, just bad execution. Like, okay, Scooby-Doo is probably the monster of the week show that comes to mind when you think of this sort of thing, depending on your age, but part of why it works is that episodes are short, self-contained, and there are a lot of them, as opposed to having only a handful of super long episodes. I think that this is where Raincode's reliance on its relationship to Danganronpa probably hurts it the most. It would have probably been a much better game if it had been 15 or so chapters where you'd have a couple smaller mysteries followed by maybe a single bigger one to wrap up a whole arc or something. The game also tends to just drag things out way, way too much, in large part because of its other big storytelling issue: how it handles the people that you do get to know.
Huh? Someone's there. I heard a voice behind the door.
In Raincode, you're paired up with a different master detective for each chapter, aside from the prologue and the final chapter. Halara is chapter 1, Tetsuhiko is chapter 2, Fubuki is chapter 3, and Vivia is chapter 4. And this structure, it's just bad. I think they were kind of trying to find a middle ground with the Danganronpa format where your character typically has their assistant, but it just doesn't work for this game at all. Very little time is spent with all the detectives together, and you don't really get to actively build relationships with any of them. You recover lost memories of your existing relationships, but those just come from collectibles scattered randomly in the map. Before your paired chapter, you don't really get to know them much. During their chapter, you'd better hope you really like them because you're going to be spending a stupid amount of time with them. After their chapter, you not only rarely interact with them, but they've also forgotten half your relationship because they can't keep their memories from the mystery labyrinth. Again, if the chapters were smaller and broken up more, it'd be less of an issue, but you'll spend like 8 hours with a single character at a time on a single case, and then that's it with them. And if you like the characters, sure, it can be alright. Like, Halara is really, really strong in their chapter. But then you have chapter 2 with Tetsuhiko, and he single-handedly drags down the chapter hard. Since you spend so little time with most of the roster, they tend to get boiled down to just a single personality trait plus their magic detective ability. Halara is competent for a paycheck, Tetsuhiko is a sex pest, Fubuki is a moron, and Vivia is emo. It doesn't just hurt their characterizations, but it also contaminates other characters. Like, Shinigami is constantly throwing around insults, but she doesn't have much to aim at, so it just ends up being repetitive and annoying. Again, this tries to pull from Danganronpa's structure, but in those games you have one partner that you stick with throughout the game as your primary partner, and also you still spend time with everyone else. Like, in Raincode, you only have your partner detective in the mystery labyrinth. In a class trial, you have everybody present, so it makes a lot more sense for it to take longer. You have to convince more people and deal with more conflicting stories, and everyone's pointing the finger at one another. The detectives don't remember the case once they enter the labyrinth, and they forget everything once they leave. They don't have any sort of a real stake in it. They aren't pointing fingers at one another. There's not that kind of tension. It ultimately just leaves you feeling kind of empty by the end of it all. You don't know these characters. You don't have an attachment to the victims, the culprits, or your fellow investigators. Ultimately, Raincode does do some really clever things with its relationship to Danganronpa, but it's just not a net positive. Too much is lost that could have made this story interesting or unhinged in its own right thanks to its over-reliance on a different franchise with a different premise that doesn't translate neatly over to this one. This game and the story it's trying to tell aren't inherently bad, and I want to make that clear, but it should have been allowed to have its own structure. It's an underwhelming Danganronpa game because it's not a Danganronpa game, but it's an underwhelming Master Detective Archives game because it's trying too hard to be a Danganronpa game. If there's one real takeaway as far as unhinged storytelling goes with Raincode, it's that you need to tailor the structure to the story you're trying to tell. You can't tell Yuma's story with Makoto's framework. The less conventional your story is, the more work has to go into ensuring that the structure is built around accommodating those unconventional elements. Every other franchise we've talked about so far, Danganronpa, Zero Escape, and the Somnium Files, prioritize developing a structure that suited the story, but Raincode tries to borrow a structure, and it suffers for it.
Guess not. So you called yourself a member without even knowing.
Yes, sorry.
at this point, there's not really much else to say, honestly. We've talked about 9 games that have taken us absolutely ages, and hopefully, maybe we've all learned something about unhinged storytelling on the way. Spike Chunsoft games aren't like the only unhinged stories out there. There are a lot from a lot of other studios that do it better, worse, or just differently. But I've had a lot of fun talking about some of the things that do and don't work in these kinds of stories, and I hope you have too. If you've enjoyed this, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and if you'd like to see more from me, you should check out these other videos I put out recently about why the Florida Mayhem made a gay Overwatch ship part of their brand, and my best attempt to shamelessly capitalize on the Barbie hype by talking about Barbie Girl, Rule 34 Overwatch content, and how corporations lose control of their characters. If you'd like to check those out, you can click the card in the top right, or wait a minute for them to pop up on screen. As well, if you'd like to support my brain damage, you can become a channel member for $5 by clicking the join button below to get access to special emotes, badges, and the members' choice polls. This video was originally chosen by the July members in the members' choice poll for that month, and then it became a massively overblown project and faced some delays, and I just hope that my members are satisfied with what they chose. Like I said at the top of the video, the August poll is going to be between these 5 topics. The first is why didn't true crime cross over into video games? A topic focused on why the true crime genre never made it into gaming the way it did with podcasts, TV, movies, and more. And the second is positive and negative balance, a topic about different balance philosophies when it comes to Overwatch, focusing on buffing versus nerfing, too strong versus too weak, and all that fun stuff. The third is philosophies of Overwatch's heroes, a topic about the philosophies of Overwatch's heroes, why they do what they do, and what it says about the game and the universe they're in. Please note that if this one wins, it'll probably be a long video, so that'll also involve some delays. The fourth is Cyberpunk 2077 and the importance of understanding your genre, a topic about how a game that matches the genre's aesthetic but misses the mark on its themes is doing itself a disservice. And finally, why developers don't fix obvious problems with obvious solutions, a topic focusing on why there seem to be so many situations where players can identify something as a problem and identify a solution to that problem, only to see the devs seemingly dragging their feet on fixing it. Channel memberships purchased or renewed today will last a full 31 days, meaning that you not only get to vote in this poll, but the next one too. Lastly, thank you very much to all my channel members. Insert name here, MiniQ, Olesp, Cage the Orc, Surtur Z, The Afro of Doom, Nballs, Xander K, Gavos, Kirby PPG, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Indy D, Dextiny, Remy, Vamplin, Popsnack, Lenny, Connor, Circo, Damp Weasel, Nature Big Fan, Yoshi of the Wire, and Peggy, CatLover192, Windex the Great, Sourdough, and Illuma Riley. Whether you're a member, a subscriber, or just a casual viewer, thank you so much for watching, especially with how long this one has been, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.